What if the greatest victory in the ancient world was won by a man who let himself get completely surrounded and did it on purpose? And what if that same man was so buried in debt that he had to bet his entire future on a plan that almost every rational commander of his day would have called suicide? I want you to stand with me for a moment, right here, on a narrow strip of open ground in the heart of ancient Gaul. Behind you, high up on a plateau, 80,000 warriors are trapped, starving, and desperate, waiting for any opening to come pouring down the slopes and cut you to pieces. And in front of you, stretching across the hills and valleys as far as the eye can follow, a second army is marching straight toward your position, and this one is even larger. By some ancient accounts, it numbers more than 250,000 men. You are caught between these two forces, and standing between you and total annihilation is nothing but a line of wooden stakes and a trench bristling with sharpened branches. Now here is the part that has puzzled soldiers and historians for more than 2,000 years. By every rule of warfare ever written, this should have ended in disaster, and the man in the middle should have been crushed. Instead, he walked away with the defining triumph of his life, a victory so bold that his enemies simply could not believe he was actually attempting it. In the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly how he did it, and why the finest military minds still study this single battle today. Because hidden inside this story is a lesson not only about war, but about how one person can stand firm when every path seems to close. Welcome back to the channel, and thank you, truly, for spending part of your day here with me. If you love the stories where history stops being a list of dates and starts feeling like something you can almost touch, then you are in exactly the right place, and I would be grateful if you took a moment to subscribe so we can keep walking through the great moments of the past together. Now, to understand how one man ended up wedged between two armies in the middle of Gaul, we have to rewind a few years, and we have to start with something that rarely makes it into the heroic version of the story. Before he was a legend, he was a man drowning in debt. By the year 60 before the Common Era, he held only a handful of minor offices, and he had spent staggering sums of money buying the goodwill of the Roman crowd, throwing games, funding feasts, and financing his own rise. He owed fortunes he could not possibly repay, and in the brutal arithmetic of Roman politics, there was really only one way out. He needed a war. Not a small war, but a grand one, the kind that could deliver the two things Rome valued above almost everything else: glory and plunder. Gaul was his answer. And so for 6 long years he threw himself into it without pause, marching his legions across the lands we now call France and Belgium, into the edges of Germany, and even twice across the Channel into Britain. The man was relentless. Every single summer brought another campaign, another people forced into submission, another stretch of territory swallowed into the growing Roman world, and back in Rome, his name climbed higher with every victory. But I want you to pause and see this from the other side, because the people of Gaul were living through something very different. Year after year, their villages were burned, their grain was seized, their leaders were forced to hand over hostages, and puppet rulers loyal to Rome were installed over them. And if you ever wonder why a whole land would finally rise up and risk everything, consider what happened at one town called Avaricum. After a long and bitter siege there, the Roman army put nearly 40,000 people to the sword, a reprisal for the weeks of hunger and hard labor the siege had cost them. That is the kind of memory that does not fade. That is the kind of wound that turns scattered, quarreling tribes into a single burning cause. And here is a truth worth sitting with for a moment, because it echoes through every age that has ever come after. Empires are almost always built on a human cost that the victory speeches leave out, and a people pushed far enough, treated harshly enough, will eventually reach a breaking point. Gaul was very close to reaching its own. Every great uprising needs a leader, and the one who finally rose to unite the tribes of Gaul was a young nobleman of the Arverni named Vercingetorix. But before you picture a flawless hero, let me tell you where he came from, because his story begins with a shadow. His own father, Celtios, had once been put to death by his fellow Gauls, accused of reaching for a crown he was not entitled to. So this was a man born into the memory of ambition, punished by death. And in a strange twist of fate, ambition would one day cost him his life, too. He did not start at the top. When he first called for rebellion, the very nobles of his own town, including his uncle Gobernitio, threw him out, convinced that defying Rome was far too dangerous. So he did something remarkable. He gathered the poor, the overlooked, the ones with nothing left to lose, built them into a force, marched back, seized the town, and had himself hailed as king. And here is what set him apart from every Gallic leader before him. He understood something they had all missed. You could not beat the Roman legions by meeting them head-on, because they were too disciplined, too well-trained, too experienced in open battle. So instead of charging into slaughter, he chose patience. He ordered the tribes to burn their own crops, empty their own villages, and deny the Romans any food or shelter along their path. If the legions could not eat, they could not march, and they could not fight. It was harsh, it was painful for his own people, but it was brilliant, and for the first time in the entire war, the Gauls were following a single unified strategy instead of 100 scattered quarrels. And it worked. Roman supply lines began to buckle. Foraging parties vanished into the forests and never came back, and one by one the tribes that had been sitting on the fence came over to the rebellion. Even the Aedui, who had been among Rome's most loyal allies for years, switched sides, and that was a staggering blow. Now, I will not paint him as a saint, because he was not one. He held his fragile coalition together with iron discipline and by taking hostages from the tribes, ruling as much through fear as through inspiration. But make no mistake, he had become the one thing Rome truly dreaded, a united enemy with a real plan. And then came the moment the whole war seemed to turn. At a hilltop stronghold called Gergovia, the Roman assault went badly wrong. Soldiers pushed too far up the slopes, got cut off, and were driven back with heavy losses, nearly 700 legionaries dead, including 46 centurions. Now, you have to understand what those centurions meant. They were the backbone of the army, the seasoned veterans who held the line steady in the chaos and led from the front, and losing 46 of them in a single afternoon sent a shockwave through every rank. Here is a detail worth pausing on, though, because it reveals something about how history gets written. In his own account, the great general claimed he had merely ordered his men to take a nearby hill and then sounded the retreat, as if the disaster were a misunderstanding, not a defeat. But many historians today doubt that story and suspect he shaped it carefully to protect his own reputation. And that is a quiet reminder for all of us. The man telling the story was also the man writing the history. Whatever really happened, the message raced across Gaul like wildfire. Rome could be beaten, yet defeat had a way of sharpening this general rather than breaking him. He regrouped, recruited fierce Germanic horsemen to strengthen his cavalry, struck back hard, and forced his rival to fall back with roughly 80,000 warriors to a fortress town called Alesia. And that is where everything would be decided. Picture the place where all of this came to a head. Alesia sat on the flat top of a hill, rising about 500 feet above the plains around it, with steep slopes on nearly every side and 2 rivers running through the valleys below. It was a natural stronghold, and the plan behind those walls was simple but deadly. Sit tight on the high ground, hold out with the supplies at hand, send riders racing to every corner of Gaul, and wait for a massive relief army to arrive and crush the Romans between 2 forces. It was, honestly, the best move available, and it rested on one confident bet, the belief that no sane commander would ever try to besiege a hilltop fortress while 250,000 warriors were marching toward his back. Any reasonable general would have recognized the danger and pulled back to safer ground. But the man outside those walls was not reasonable in the ordinary sense. He looked at the terrain, he did the math, and then he ordered his engineers to start building. And what they built over the next 3 weeks is one of the most astonishing feats of engineering the ancient world ever saw. They constructed a continuous ring of fortifications completely encircling the hill, roughly 11 miles of walls, ditches, and towers, an unbroken loop around the entire position. And these were no ordinary soldiers. Roman legionaries carried digging tools right alongside their swords, trained to be builders as much as fighters. And now they were asked to raise an earth and timber wall about 12 feet high, crowned with a wooden palisade, with watchtowers set at regular intervals, 33 of them in all. But the wall itself was only the beginning, because in front of it they laid a nightmare in layers, and the soldiers gave each layer its own grim nickname. There were rows of sharpened stakes, sunk deep and lashed together so they could not be pulled free, and these they called sippi, the word for gravestones. In front of those were hidden pits, each holding a fire-hardened stake as thick as a man's thigh, the tip barely poking above the ground and covered over with brush, arranged in a careful staggered pattern, and because the mouth of each pit looked like the cup of a blossom, they named them lilies. And scattered ahead of all of it were iron-barbed hooks set at an angle into the earth, called stimuli, the goads. It was, in every sense, a killing field, designed to make any charge a slow and murderous ordeal. And here is a detail that tells you everything about the mind behind it. This was a man who, years earlier, had once diverted an entire river into a Roman arena just to stage a mock naval battle for public entertainment. So flooding a trench at Alesia with water pulled from the nearby rivers was, to him, nothing new at all. Then word came that the relief army was real, and it was enormous. So he ordered a second ring built, this one facing outward, another 14 miles of the same walls, the same traps, the same towers, but pointing the opposite way to hold off an attack from behind. Think carefully about what that means. His roughly 60,000 men now stood inside a corridor of their own making, with 80,000 desperate warriors above them and a relief force outside that ancient sources put at more than 250,000. His officers must have thought he had lost his mind. But he understood something most commanders of his day did not. Walls are a force multiplier. A smaller army behind strong defenses can hold off a far larger one because the attackers are funneled into narrow killing zones while the defenders concentrate their strength exactly where it is needed. He was not trapped between two armies. He had built himself a fortress inside a fortress. Meanwhile, inside Alesia, a quieter and far more painful battle was unfolding. There were 80,000 mouths to feed, and only enough grain for a few weeks, and as the days stretched on, the granaries emptied. The despair grew so deep that, according to one account, a chieftain named Critognatus is said to have proposed a horror almost too dark to speak of, though I will tell you plainly that most scholars believe that speech was shaped later for dramatic effect, likely drawn from prisoners describing the mood in those final days. What we do know is genuinely heartbreaking. To save food for the fighters, the townspeople, the local mandubii, were sent out through the gates, their women and children among them, and when they reached the Roman lines they wept and begged to be taken even as slaves, if only they might be fed. But the answer was no. They were left stranded in the empty ground between the hilltop and the Roman walls, with nowhere to go and nothing to eat. It was cold, it was calculated, and it was effective, and it is the part of this story I ask you to carry with the most compassion. And then, on the horizon, the relief army finally appeared. The first great assault came at night. The relief force threw itself against the outer walls, while the warriors on the hilltop poured down against the inner ones, and suddenly the Romans were fighting on two fronts in the dark, scrambling between positions as arrows and javelins rained in from both directions. The noise alone must have been terrifying. Thousands of voices howling in the blackness, the crash of bodies against timber, and the Romans held, barely, but they held. Then the attackers learned something. On the northwest side, near a height called Mont Rhea, the ground had made it impossible to close the ring perfectly, leaving a weak point defended by two camps, without the same depth of traps protecting the rest of the line. So the Gauls chose their best 60,000 warriors and sent them on a wide march to strike that gap from the outside, while everyone else attacked all at once. This was the moment the entire siege came down to, because if they broke through there, they would pour into the corridor from behind and the whole system would collapse. The gap buckled. The camps there began to give way, and every other stretch of wall was screaming for reinforcements at the same time. And here is where leadership stops being a word and becomes a picture you can see. The general rode along his own lines in a bright red cloak, deliberately visible, so his exhausted men could find him in the chaos and know he had not abandoned them. He sent his most trusted officer, Titus Labienus, to hold the failing point at all costs. And then he played his final card. He gathered his reserve cavalry, those fierce Germanic horsemen, and led them on a wide ride around the outside of the fortifications, hidden behind the hills, until they came thundering into the rear of the Gauls attacking that northern gap. And just like that, the trap was reversed. The very pincer the Gauls had spent the entire war trying to spring on the Romans was now closing on them, caught between the defenders in front and the cavalry crashing in from behind. Their best warriors broke and ran, and when the rest of the relief army saw it, panic spread, and that vast host that had seemed unstoppable simply dissolved into the countryside. From the hilltop, the man who had united Gaul watched his last hope scatter, and he knew it was over. What happened next is one of the most haunting scenes in all of ancient history, and it comes to us in two versions. In the dramatic telling, he put on his finest armor, decorated his horse, rode out alone, circled the seated Roman general, then dismounted, laid down his weapons, and sat in silence at his feet. In the general's own quieter account, the surrender was far more subdued. And that difference is worth remembering, because once again, the man who won the battle was the man writing the record. There is one more detail I find almost unbearably human. According to a later historian, he had not been captured and was not even wounded. He could have fled, but he chose to surrender, hoping for mercy from a man he had once counted as a friend. That hope was misplaced. He spent the next 6 years in a Roman prison, was paraded through the streets during a great triumph, and was then quietly put to death. And here is the part that tells you how deliberate that ending was. Executing a captive after a triumph was not the usual Roman practice, and other defeated kings had been spared before him. His death most likely came from the weight of a public that still wanted vengeance. So what did all of it mean? Gaul became a Roman province and remained under Roman control for the next 500 years. The Latin the soldiers carried with them slowly grew into the French, spoken today. The victory made the general fabulously rich, gave him an army devoted to him alone, and set him on the road that led to crossing the Rubicon, to becoming dictator, and finally to dying on the Senate floor beneath 23 dagger blows. But before we close, let me hand you back that number from the very beginning. Remember the relief army of more than 250,000. Historians now believe that figure was almost certainly inflated to magnify the triumph, and that a more honest count sits somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000. Impressive still, but a reminder that numbers, in the hands of the victor, are a weapon of their own. And this is why the battle still matters, even for us, even now. The United States Military Academy at West Point includes this siege in its own study atlases, with animations provided by the Army's Combat Studies Institute, placing it beside the great turning points of military history. It endures because of a handful of lessons that never age. The power of interior lines, standing between two enemies yet moving faster within your own position than they can around it. Engineering under pressure. The mastery of terrain, supply, and the human spirit, and leadership that adapts in the very heat of the moment. There is even a striking mirror here, because centuries earlier, at a place called Cannae, a great enemy of Rome had wrapped his forces around a larger Roman army and destroyed it. At Alesia, a Roman turned that same bloody lesson inside out and used it against his own foes. The ground where all of this happened still exists. You can visit it near a village in the Burgundy region of France, where 19th century diggers first uncovered the trenches and the pits, where aerial photographs later revealed the ghostly outlines of the old siege works still traced faintly in the crops, and where a museum now stands to tell the story. And so I will leave you with the thought that has stayed with me the longest. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to those who oppose you is to let them believe they have you exactly where they want you. Because true strength is rarely loud. It is preparation and patience, and the steady nerve to stand firm when every path seems to close. Thank you for standing here with me through all of it. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell me which battle from the ancient world you would like us to walk through next.